I call this February 2nd, 2023 Planning Convention meeting to order. We have a very short agenda tonight, so hopefully it's not going to be too late before we leave tonight. I want to welcome Katie to the Planning Commission.
Thank you.
The first item to consider are the minutes from the last meeting.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to actually make a motion to defer the minutes until our March meeting. There's a few tweaks that I want to talk with Tracy about making to the minutes. So if we could defer those to March.
Okay. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
A motion has been made and properly seconded. All in favor? Motion carries. That's deferred to the March meeting. The only agenda item we have is PH-23-02, UDC text amendments, procedures to establish a residential infill overlay district.
Do we have a workshop?
We're going to do the,
Oh, we have a workshop?
Yes.
must have snuck
Oh.
one in.
Okay. We are going to do a workshop first before we consider that item then on deferrals, tabling, and postponement.
Sure, that'd be great.
All right.
Welcome. How are you guys this evening?
We are doing
Great,
wonderful.
thank you.
Good. Mr. Woodman asked me to come and do a little workshop with you guys on motions. So I prepared a handout for you guys, and we'll just go through a couple slides. I think I emailed them to Eric as well, but they'll be here to you shortly. Kathy's going to pass those out. So as you guys know, we do have a new city attorney. They came on probably in earlier this year in the summertime, probably around June or July. And you guys have probably seen a couple motion terms at city council meetings, one of those being a motion to postpone. And so we just thought this would be a good opportunity just to kind of do a review of different types of motions and motion making, and let you guys ask any questions if you have identified any tricky spots. So this will just kind of be a brief overview, and you guys can ask questions as you would like as well. So as you guys know, with every item that comes before the commission, they require some sort of action. So obviously examples of action are motion to approve, motion to deny, motion to defer, table, or even a postponement, which is probably the new motion term that you guys haven't really used a lot or seen a lot. A motion to deny, historically, I think, in our boards in the city, and even with city council items, occasionally there would be times where the board or commission may even offer a motion to deny. And in that situation, if that motion did pass successfully, say it was a vote 7-0, motion to deny was approved, that motion would be final on the item. But say, for example, there is a motion to approve and that motion were to fail, say from a vote from 5-2 or 4-3, there would need to be a subsequent motion that is made, and that motion could be a couple of different things. So there's two types of affirmative motions which basically put an end to the application, either a motion to approve or a motion to deny. A motion to approve, as you guys know, could have conditions, it could not have conditions, and that would be your recommendation that move forward to council. Motion to deny would be a final action of this commission, which would also go to the city council as your recommendation and the final action on the application. There's three types of motions which would essentially put a pause or a hold on any applications or agenda items. You guys would know those as a motion to postpone, motion to defer, or a motion to table.
Hey, Lauren, I'm sorry just to interrupt you just for 1 second, but go back to deny and give the perspective from the applicant for a second.
Yeah.
Say it is declined, how long does the applicant need to wait before he can represent an application? What is that?
So it all really just depends on the application. Typically, as Kathy could probably speak to this as well, typically if there is an application, some do have a waiting period of about 12 months. At which they could apply for a variance with city council to reduce that amount. Oftentimes you will see city council go ahead and add that on as a condition of that denial to go ahead and reduce that waiting period from 12 to 6 months. And that Yep, state law is 6 months. Ours is 12 months. So, yes.
So what's that exact, without prejudice? Is that what it is? So
Yes.
I want to make sure we're really defining
That
it
is
when you're going through that.
Yep,
And that's really applicable to, we recommend to city council. So the city council is the one that's making the decision whether we deny it or not. Unless we table or defer, it still goes to city council.
yep.
So actually, can I also ask a question before you move forward,
Yeah.
Lauren? When you spoke about if a motion fails.
Yes.
So if a motion, an application, a motion is made to recommend approval, and the vote is 3-4,
Or, yes, okay.
so it fails. You're saying we then need to make a second motion?
That is correct. So if there is a motion that fails, another motion needs to be introduced until such a motion passes. And that motion could be either a motion to deny, it could be another motion to approve with different conditions, it could be a motion to table, it could be a motion to defer, it could be a motion to postpone. But you would just keep offering motions until something finally passes, because that essentially means that the consensus or majority of this commission has made a final decision on the application or the item.
So what happens if our last meeting, we had that exact occurrence occur, and and it was a 3-4, and there were no additional motions?
And I think I know which application you're speaking of, and I believe it was interpreted by staff at that time what the intent of the board was. And I think that language was added in the recommendation that went forward to City Council. I think Mr. Woodman could probably speak specifically to that. But I believe at that point there was essentially background information that was provided to council on that item, but I don't know that it actually was coupled with a recommendation, and Michael can speak to that.
What ultimately went forward with that one is that there was no recommendation from Planning Commission.
Okay, so that's how it moved forward?
It did move
without
forward
yes.
without a recommendation
Okay.
from Planning Commission. Because what should have happened is when the motion failed, we should have introduced a new motion. We didn't speak up and clarify that with you, but that's the way that it did move
Okay,
forward.
so moving forward, though, now we all know that we shouldn't leave it kind of hanging there like that? Okay,
Correct.
got it, thank you.
Michael or Lauren?
Yes.
On that then, so it's a perfect example. So then one of the four, or it could have been one of the, I had made a motion to approve, and that was declined. So it was a 3-4 vote. So either somebody, any of us, but let's just say one of the four could have said, we make a motion to now deny that.
That is correct. That could have been an option of the commission. That's an example. We'll just speak in general terms, so we're not speaking about specific
Right.
applications. But either the three that agreed with your motion could offer an additional motion with new conditions or amended conditions, or anyone could have offered a motion to deny at that point. You could have also decided, hey, let's go ahead and postpone the decision, and someone could have offered that as an additional motion, but you're right. So another motion would need to be made, and hopefully that would pass by a majority, and then that would kind of conclude that item.
Okay, that makes sense.
A no motion is a no recommendation.
So I have a question about, so if this body denies, it doesn't trigger the 6-month wait. It would have to be council that would trigger that, correct?
That is correct. The Planning Commission, the way the Planning Commission is set up within the city of Alpharetta, it is a recommending board that provides recommendation to the city council for final decision. There are some jurisdictions in Georgia under zoning law that does give quasi-judicial powers to their Planning Commission. Those are things like some appeals to decisions of staff and more administrative decisions, but our Planning Commission here doesn't have that power.
Is there ever a case where perhaps the applicant puts it forward and it doesn't get a majority of approval, but there may be a situation where it would be may be advantageous for all to not have the second vote, because they could then go ahead and maybe make modifications before city council. Does that make sense?
That does sometimes make sense, and I think some of that does get ironed out occasionally, whereas sometimes Planning Commission may recommend denial of an option or an application, and they speak to certain things that they would like to see amended on the application. Sometimes they will work with staff to kind of iron that out before they do go to City Council, at which most likely they'll end up either deferring their application completely to, a couple months down the road before it goes to City Council. There's some applicants, I think, that have even withdrawn applications and resubmitted at a later date as well to try to fix any of those issues prior to coming back before either Planning Commission or City Council.
And following Katie's question, under what circumstances would, if an applicant is making a change after Planning Commission has already heard it, and if they make some changes, at what point would they have to come back to Planning Commission versus go forward to City Council with changes? Is it a magnitude, or what's the decision point?
I think that might be a good question asked by Michael. I think sometimes it depends on the extent possibly of their request. And I'll let Michael speak to that a little bit more.
If after the applicant is before this board and heading to city council, they make substantial changes to their site plan or to their request, we would encourage that applicant to bring the new site plan back and request back to Planning Commission. We don't really have specific criteria as to what constitutes making an applicant come back to Planning Commission. It's really up to our judgment. But if there are major changes where it's a wholesale change to the site plan or something to the request, we always try to push them back to bring it back to Planning Commission. So I don't have a specific answer for you there.
What then drives re-advertising? When do they have to go back and?
So if their new plan, they've added variances or the language in the legal advertisement changes. So if they're asking if we advertise it to rezoning of a property in order to construct a 5,000 square foot building and they come back with a 10,000 square foot building, we would have to re-advertise.
And that starts a new clock?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So that's kind of what I'll get into next in terms of legal advertising. But go, Perkins, or Commissioner Perkins, did you have a question?
So just a quick one.
Mr. Stratton.
So last month, we had 2 hearings where we tabled, we used the term table. Now, whether defer was more appropriate.
No, we said defer.
Okay, defer.
Yep.
We said defer twice. So, and both of those applicants have to come back to Planning Commission. But if we defer as a group, does that trigger an automatic return to Planning Commission? I thought it did.
Yes.
Regardless of the magnitude of the changes desired or anything like that.
And that goes back to somewhat of the differentiation between a final action on the item or the application, which is either approval or denial, which moves forward to council, versus kind of what I call the lingering motions, deferral, postponement, tabling,
Right.
which keeps them within your purview prior to going to city council. So yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I just have one comment.
Yes.
Since I've been in the Planning Commission since 2008, can't believe it's been 14 years now. I had to use the word assumed, but it's implied that if a motion to approve fails and you ask those in opposition to that motion, that's effectively a denial. I appreciate the clarification so that if there is not a majority that approves a motion to approve, either in a planning commission, I can ask for another motion, either to defer or to deny or to table. And if there is no motion, that means there is no recommendation. I think it's better to give council clarity regarding what the board is recommending to council.
Right.
And, although it's not that we have made any mistakes in not asking for a separate motion, because when I ask you to make a motion, if nobody is willing to make a motion, we can continue debate
Right.
over and over until somebody cause the question. But anyway, we will now, from now on, if a motion doesn't pass, an approval motion, then one of the commissioners can then ask a motion to deny or offer another motion, a deferral, or continue debate within reason. But the assumption has been if there is opposition, the majority is in opposition to a motion to approve, that's a denial. So we will follow the new protocol.
Yes, and you're exactly right there. I mean, conversationally speaking, if there is a motion that is offered and not a majority decides to vote upon it,
The motion fails.
you're just kind of sitting there being like, okay, so now what do we want to do with this application, So, and it could be any motion that is not approved by a majority. It could be, even if for a denial, deferral, table, any motion that doesn't win by a majority, a new substitute motion would need to be made, yes.
If it doesn't get a majority for an approval, and it doesn't get a majority for a denial, can the board make the decision to send it forward with no recommendation?
I'm going to leave that determination for staff in terms of the planning commission deciding based on the motions and discussion of the application, can planning commission offer no recommendation and it still move forward to city council?
But that's not a motion, though.
I've not seen that happen. The only time that I've experienced where it's gone forward without a recommendation is the example that we were referring to earlier. But I have not seen where a planning commission would just not make a recommendation at all. I do think that if an application comes before you, I think that there's got to be a decision or recommendation one way or the other.
Yes.
Just in the generic terms, then, as an example, then does that open it up and allow the chairman to say, okay, now we're back open for discussion again? Is that what happens?
You could, yes. You could, most definitely.
Generally, and
Or-
when a motion is made and seconded, and just conversational, my job is to facilitate discussion and a decision to be made, but most important consensus of the board. We have been appointed by council and the mayor to facilitate a public process and make a recommendation to council. The council does not always have to agree with what we recommend, but we have facilitated a process that gives them a little bit of more information because they can hear what we are saying. You can offer a substitute before the motion is voted on. And if you do that, we have to vote on the substitute before the main motion is voted on. So although we have not done anything wrong by not making, we haven't had many motions that failed and there was not a recommendation in this board for as many years as I've been here. This was a special case. The assumption was, well, if there was a question, those against the motion, that means you are effectively denying the motion, but it's better to be clear that that's what we are voting on.
Correct. It's
And
a very,
Mr. Chairman, usually when that happens, it's usually there's disagreement within the conditions. And your idea is to kind of bring that forward and see if we can find a middle ground within those conditions that we can ultimately be efficient and push it forward.
And sometimes I'll prolong debate just for that reason, because I can hear what people are saying, but we can only discuss motions for so long without making a decision.
that's right. And then Eric, if you don't mind to move slides over. So another thing I think you guys had a few questions about was terms of legal advertisement and when do we submit a new legal advertisement. A couple people have already had questions. So I just pulled the zoning procedures law, which is our state law that we follow in terms of public hearing applications. So in terms of deferrals, postponements, tables, typically all of the legal advertising has to be published in our general circulation newspaper, which we use, which is the Alpharetta the Alpharetta Roswell Herald, for 15 days prior to that hearing. So in determining what to do on an application if there's a potential for a deferral or a table or a postponement, which we'll get into just a minute. It's kind of nice to maybe ask of staff or consider that, and when making those types of motions, when the next planning commission meeting is, how long the applicant may need to make some adjustments to the application, so staff can determine whether or not we can meet our legal advertising deadlines. Just from a staff perspective, in our communication and working with our App and Media, who publishes our newspaper, generally they have an advertising deadline of the Wednesday. If your advertising deadline is on a Wednesday, it goes to publication the following Thursday. So with your planning commission meetings being on a Thursday, that misses the Wednesday deadline to have something published in the paper the following week. So that adds essentially on another week. So there might be some months where if you guys defer, table, or postpone an application or an item, that it might not be able to be advertised to meet the zoning procedures law requirements prior to your next meeting. This month is a great example because February is a short month. It only ends up being about 14 days that it would be advertised if you were to defer it to the next month. So while we do love to see items move quickly through the channels and not have applicants defer or applications defer, it might be a 2-month deferral as opposed to a 1 month, just with the way those legal advertising goes.
So do all deferrals, all tables, and all postponements have to be re-advertised?
Essentially, that would be the best practice. There may be a couple of circumstances here and there where it, depending on how many previous publications there have been, where it may not be able to be legally advertised, but that would be the best practice.
Let me make up, and I'm glad we are talking about this. When you defer an application, you need to defer it to a specific date. I think that's what you're saying, and we need to make sure that, and this is a point of clarification. Because this is a public meeting and we actually defer to a specific date, what is the need to re-advertise again? Isn't that effectively advertising that, or you're talking about putting it in the legal organ?
Repeating it.
Is a legal requirement.
Correct.
Not just mentioning it.
Correct.
In the planning commission.
Yes.
In the legal organ, okay.
Yes, the publication in the legal ordering, if you're going by the strict letter of the law as prescribed by the zoning procedures law, that's considered to be placing the advertisement and the legal notice by it physically being printed in the newspaper.
So I'd like to jump in. I really want legal to go back and take a look at that because I just see so many problems right there. I mean, I can understand substantially changing the application and kind of moving that forward, but there's a lot of times in, when we look at the three soft ones, I guess we could say tabling. Tabling, I would consider, comes up more and more when we see a distance between the applicant and staff, that they really kind of haven't shared their collective kind of ideas of bringing together more an application that works. Usually I go right to tabling because they need to get back together. But substantially, that application stands the way it is. Now, there's a distance in time where we might delay that 30 days to the next one. The reason why I'm getting that is also have the perspective and the consideration of our applicants. Yeah. They're before us, going through their process. They have third parties. There's a cost kind of to this. There's a frustration that immediately you're triggering a 45-day delay, a 60-day delay in their window for, that's pretty painful. I mean, you're saying immediately to do that. I would challenge that and just ask staff to really kind of challenge that, ask our legal kind of components to really kind of go back. If substantially it changes, totally understand. But substantially, if that application does not, and we table it for a reason of just we haven't connected ideas and there's no major pieces that have changed, and we just shift it 60 days, I would argue that all day long. I don't think that's fair, and I would like us to look at that again.
No, I definitely.
I don't know how everyone else feels about it, but I mean, if you're on the other side or you're kind of moving through that, that's a lot of moving pieces.
And I definitely understand your perspective on that, and that was one of the questions that I had with the city attorney as well. And I know oftentimes our community development department, they're constantly working with our applicants, and oftentimes if there are big issues that have been identified by staff, there will be some times where an applicant or staff may even say it might be better to go ahead and defer this application. And in those kind of situations, as long as they could let us know before the advertising deadline, that would help hopefully save some of that time as well. I know staff works very diligently with the applicants to try to ensure that as soon as they know about a deferral, they're on it as soon as getting the notices to media, changing the website, changing the signs to make sure we're in compliance there. And there may be some situations where, depending on the number of times it has been previously advertised, and we'll kind of go into some best practices as well to kind of discuss that next too, but just kind of wanted you to have the black letter law of what's within the state code on legal advertising as well. And then if you don't mind, change the next slide, Eric, for me. Thank you. So the three motions that we've kind of already been circling around, motion to postpone, motion to defer, and motion to table. So typically, when I am working with our boards and commissions, generally our board members have a good idea of what these three motions are. And sometimes board members or commissioners often use these terms interchangeably. So in my opinion, and in speaking with our city attorney, the motion to postpone could be perceived as a best practice option for a couple reasons. I think Chairman said earlier, defer is to a date certain, and that's, I think, how we were all taught. If you have a deferral, you need to pick a date, and that's the way that you would make the motion, sounding something as though motion to defer this application to the March 2nd, 2023 Planning Commission meeting. And usually by Robert's Rules of Order, that does have a specific date tied to it. And it's usually to the next month, or maybe if the applicant said, hey, I think we could, get this tied up in the next 2 months, you guys might pick the April meeting instead. An alternative to that, which we do not use as much anymore, is the motion to table, or I haven't seen it as much with our boards and commissions. Generally, there's a lot of discussion in Robert's Rules of Order on how the motion to table is supposed to be used. If you're reading specifically the Robert's Rules of Order, the way that it was originally prescribed to work is, say, a member of the board would make a motion to table as a way to just kind of cut the conversation on the item and say, we'll get to this later. You could remove it from the table then later on and during that meeting, or at the next scheduled meeting is the way the motion to table has worked. Motion to table, when it was developed with Robert's Rules of Order, was a good motion to have, say, for boards or commissions that meet fairly regularly. Maybe more than just one time a month. With you guys only meeting one time a month, it still puts 30 days in between each of your meetings. Motion to tables by the black law of, letter law of Robert's Rules. For example, if you made a motion tonight to put something on the table, it would then go immediately on the March 2nd agenda unless you guys removed it from the table later in tonight's meeting. The good thing about putting it on the table and it going to the next meeting is that staff already knows that it would have to be legally advertised for that next meeting. With the motion to table, say, for example, you put it on the table and then at the March 2nd meeting, no one made a motion to remove it from the table, that item just goes away forever and it could come back at any point it would like to come back. It's not required to be re-advertised on every single meeting until you pull it from the table, based on the way that this item was designed to be used in terms of a motion, which I know is probably a little bit different how the city or boards and commissions have used motion to table in the past. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions? And then we'll go to postponement after that.
When an item is tabled, there can be no changes made to it? It has to remain as it is?
That's a good question. Essentially, my understanding is that it would just remain as presented. The public hearing had occurred, but the discussion by the board and the vote and a new motion could be offered at that time, but no changes at that point. Yes, you guys are just kind of taking some time. Freezing it and waiting to make a decision at a later date.
It is true that, when you put a motion on the table, you can bring it up again during the same meeting, but there has to be a vote to take it off the table. And it's been challenging for staff, especially when they don't know when we are likely to take it off the table. But my understanding, this is something we can clarify with the state attorney, is that staff can continue working with the applicant if there needs to be, just like they would between when we vote on it and when it goes to city council. But that's something we need clarity, or staff needs clarity, because they go through the whole presentation from the beginning when it comes off the table, so they can point out what changed between the time we tabled it. But I think I'm not very familiar with postponement. I'm familiar with deferment, but yeah, if we table, you can always come back and say, let's vote to take it off the table during the same meeting.
And that would kind of be my best practice suggestion here is, say, for example, during a planning commission meeting, with everyone working remote and across the country these days, say, for example, you guys had a large application to consider and maybe part of their development team was unable to be here at the time their item was called to present, but they wanted to go ahead and start their presentation. And you guys had heard everything you'd wanted to hear, but they needed to maybe clarify one item, maybe with their legal team about an easement or something, and you guys didn't have the information that you needed to make a final decision, but maybe you had two other applications to hear that evening. Someone on the board could make a motion to table this item until the applicant had the opportunity to speak with that member on their legal team, and revisit and remove it from the table at the end of the meeting, so you could keep the meeting going and hear the other two applications. That would be a good example of how to use motion to table within the same meeting.
Let me add one more thing, and correct me if I'm wrong. Let's suppose, and I'll just use the motion we did not approve last week. You can always make a motion to reconsider. There are times when somebody may want to change their vote, but a motion has been made, seconded, voted on, but there is a reason that you may want to change your vote. You have to make that motion. Somebody has to second that motion. We have to vote on it, and if it passes, we open that whole discussion again like there was no motion before.
That's the motion that I call the change of heart motion.
That is correct.
Maybe you've had a second to think about it and had a change of heart.
So that's what could have happened. Either you can say motion to reconsider what we just approved, and second vote, then we will discuss it again, and then a motion is made or not.
So just to recap, motion to table, personally, if I were serving on a board or commission, I would only try to use that for during meeting, moving around items, or maybe we needed to hear a little bit more of the pieces. Whereas a motion to defer, I would try to work with staff prior to the motion, or maybe even at some point during the meeting, clarify with the applicant when they might have the pieces together to finally make a final decision on it. Motion to postpone, this is a motion that we haven't used a ton within our city, but is something that our city attorney had recommended a few times during some of our recent city council meetings, and thought I would just kind of discuss it with here with you all. Motion to postpone, unlike deferrals, usually have some future act that you would add on to that motion. So say, for example, the one that I provided to you all, motion to postpone until such time when staff determines this application can meet legal advertising requirements and the applicant can address the commission's concerns. That is almost a catch-all way that will either allow staff to be able to coordinate with Appen to determine when they can have something published, discuss that with legal to make sure it reaches legal advertising requirements by state law, or in the alternative, if we're also dealing with applicant concerns, for them to address that with whatever issue may be on their application. So with motion to postpone, you're not necessarily picking a date, but knowing that there's some act in the future that's going to trigger the ability for this item to come back on a future agenda. And at that point, it would be re-advertised again. There would be no motion during the meeting that would allow this item to come back, similar to the motion to unlike the motion to table. But it would just be an automatic way for you guys to kind of pick some occurrence in the future that would trigger it to come back to you all. Do you have questions about this motion? Let me know.
I'm going to go back to your comments on the motion. I know we want to speed up and get through this, so that's not my intent.
Yeah.
But it was just your commentary a little bit on the motion to table. You're kind
Yes.
of moving around the items. So normally, as a point of order, we go through, staff, applicant, public, by the time we even get to emotions. Just want to make sure that usually takes an hour, right? So we're kind of going through that. We rarely table unless there's, obviously identified issues there. But in your saying moving it around, could we immediately go in and table it without having a staff report, without having the applicant, without having the public opinion? So in that context, we could move it around before even starting the order that we would have the hearing.
You would just need to call the item. The chairman would just call the item, and
Okay.
then someone would immediately offer a motion to table.
Okay.
The only reason I would discourage from tabling before you give the public opportunity to comment is because they took the time to come over here and they want to make their comments. And you need to be fully informed before you make a decision. I feel for those who take the time to prepare and then come over here and then, they don't know that something is not going to be considered and then they have to go home. So. But we rarely table applications. We do, we've done it before, but it's.
Yes. It's one of those things where these are little nuggets of knowledge to have in the event something out of the norm comes up during a meeting. And you're like, I think Lauren talked to us about this one time. Does anybody remember what it was? And that's, Robert's rules can be applied in so many different situations. These are just a small blip of how they can be used.
And Robert's rule is not law. It's just practice. That's what
Exactly.
Robert's rule.
And that's what we're
order.
doing tonight, having a discussion and thinking about the different ways it can be used.
Correct.
Yes. Does anyone else on the commission have any questions for me at this time? Any more examples needed?
Wish you were here last month. We had lots of case studies there. No, I think this is really, really helpful. And just thinking about, the three out of the, how many items we heard last month, the practice, the option to postpone probably should have been used instead of the 2 deferrals that we did. And then clearly, we should have offered another motion for the 3-4 that was not recommended. Yeah.
To
Okay.
the Vice Chairman's point is, when we establish a date, we don't want to keep the applicant too long. And there needs to be some understanding as to what's going to happen. When you postpone, although best practice option, there is still uncertainty. They still have to go to staff, continue discussing it. But if we say we are deferring to the next meeting, and it's going to be advertised or possibly advertised, everybody knows it's coming back on that day.
Right. Right,
Postponement or table, they don't know.
right.
It's just when they are ready to bring it back. But there is going to be enough time for the public to come. There is nothing wrong with any of these motions, but what is going to facilitate the public process and really help our citizens and the applicants the best. And it's going to be on a case-by-case basis.
And so just to, I'm not speaking specifically to those individual cases, but both of those cases were deferred, I think, to our next meeting, but I think they didn't meet the advertising deadlines, so they're not, that's why we're not hearing them tonight,
I think
correct?
that's my understanding as well.
That's the reason she's here.
Yeah.
Question, and I don't know if this has to do with this perspective or if it's a question for staff. On the city's website, where each of the applications, each of the hearing items are listed, and there's a status often attached to a particular item. Right now, it may potentially just say deferred. That could mean deferred by the applicant or by Planning Commission. Should we clarify that, or am I misconstruing?
I'll let Mr. Woodman speak to that.
So the website is maintained by our web administrator. Tracy and I do send information to them as a result of the actions that are taken by this board. So typically on those items, you'll see something in like red bold, and it'll say approved, denied, deferred. That's typically meant to be an action by the board, not necessarily that the applicant has deferred the item another month. There are times when you click, you have the list of public hearing cases, and then you click on an individual case. And when you go into the individual case, you'll see the list of the meeting dates as well as their link to their application. Sometimes you will see a deferral on that page that could either be a staff deferral or an applicant deferral. So, but the main page where it has in red bold letters, that's the result of the Planning Commission or City Council.
Good, great. Thank you for the clarification.
I would venture to say this. I've said it before, but I'll say it in a public meeting that the law is behind technology. It's very few people look at the legal organ, that's what the law says we have to do. It is much more efficient now in this time and age to advertise through the website or other social media. You're more likely to capture more people.
Yep.
But that's the state legislatures to consider, but that's what's happening, that the law is lagging behind in some instances, not all, behind technology. Because that's what we are worrying about. We have enough time to advertise. They can do that instantaneously the same night on our website.
Yes. Yes, I see that a lot with state law between zoning, legal advertising, and open records law. There's a lot that I'm just, just makes you think, how could this be improved and bring it into the 21st century?
So it's been my experience usually that when you get changes, the pendulum swings too far, right? And then you kind of got to readjust the pendulum. My worry about this legal advertising is all of a sudden we start just pushing things off. I mean, let's kind of define a little of those boundaries, encroachments into buffers, variances, understand that scale, define those really, really well. And I really want staff here to really say, okay, hold on, we have to do this for legal, that we don't as a body just take what you're saying and say, oh, we have to push everything off 60 days. Because there's an impact to, not just to us, there's an impact to the applicant. It costs money. They'll have to pay additional fees for, for advertising. Staff will get log jammed because we'll see the same thing over and over again and kind of tossed it right back. And the next thing you know, we'll have 2 meetings per month. So I think there's consequences sometime for these things. So let's just be really laser focused on not have this pendulum go here and everything gets delayed 60 days.
But I'll say this, I give a lot of credit to community development because they do such a good job in preparing the package and dealing with the applicants to where they make our decision and city council decision much easier. And we've had even applicants come here and actually say how much they enjoyed working with staff. We are not a dysfunctional board. We're not a dysfunctional city, and because of the work that they put into this, that's why it makes it a whole lot easier not to defer too much or table too much and facilitate decision-making process. We don't have to do, well, we don't legislate on the floor, but we don't have to make too many, significant changes on the floor because we need staff input. So thank you for the work you do.
Yes, and thank you for letting me come and speak with you all this
Hey,
evening.
Lorna,
Thank you.
I
Yes.
did have a question
Yes.
just about on the motion to postpone and defer. Just, I guess it's, if we say, hey, I make a motion to defer, and then we should add in to the March 2nd, 2023 Planning Commission meeting, or many times the motions to defer, because there's a lot of moving parts, and we want to say, hey, wait a minute, we want the staff and the applicant to get together and kind of put it more in a concise picture. I guess you could, in the motion to postpone, instead of motion to postpone, just put the word motion to defer until such time staff determines. Is that acceptable also, to use that, or is it just to say motion to defer to the March 2nd, 2023 Planning Commission meeting?
And that's part of kind of what my conversation with you guys was about tonight, is because historically, I think these 3 terms in terms of Robert's rules have kind of been used all interchangeably. And the whole point of this conversation really was to just let everybody be on the same page, and when we are making motions, making sure that it's clear, a clear intent for everyone on the board, clear to staff, clear to the applicant, as to what the intent was. So if you did want to take it the step further and say motion to defer to the March 2nd, 2022 Planning Commission meeting,
That would probably do it in itself.
yeah, with that in itself, or you could say, or to the next meeting date, which meets legal advertising and allows the staff to make, or allows the applicant to make the changes as suggested tonight. Just so that the motion making is clear and the applicant doesn't think that they're definitely coming to the March 2nd Planning Commission meeting, but at the same time, staff has missed the legal advertising deadline and it can't be heard at the next meeting. I would just hate to create that vision for the applicant that they were going to be here the next month and then something fall through the cracks and them not be able to come forward and present to you all.
No, a couple of points, and I know we don't do this a lot when we are discussing or voting on an item. Sometimes it's important to really be very clear of what the expectation of the board is, and we speak most of the times in one voice. If we are tabling or deferring or postponing, there should be what the expectation is when it comes back through our discussion or pointing out exactly what you are looking for individually and collectively. There are times when board members or council members or governing authority members, whatever it is, will explain their vote. I'm not going to support this for these reasons. It's been rare, but it happened before when I thought a motion was going one way, but it went an exact opposite way. And if I'm in the Planning Commission and I really don't know, I can't read what the board's decision is going to be, what about the public and the applicant? So it's important to be clear on why you're not supporting or whatever you're voting, if you feel led to do so, for clarity to the public, to the elected officials, to staff, and to the applicant.
Yes. So, thank you all again. Enjoy your evening. It's good
Thank
to see you all.
Appreciate it.
Have a wonderful night.
Thanks for agreeing to come out every month and coach us.
All right, now we can go to the items for consideration tonight. And I need to clarify something with staff just for future, because I got confused for that very reason. I didn't see the workshop. We don't advertise workshops, do we?
No.
We don't.
No.
And because, so this was not, what was advertised as the agenda did include the workshop in it?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yes. Chairman, did you want me to continue with the item?
The next item is
I was thinking, did you call it?
PH-23-02, UDC text amendments. Ms. Kathy Cook.
Thank you.
Now you can continue.
Thank you. I couldn't remember if you called it or not, so, yeah. So the item before you tonight, it's consideration of text amendments to the Unified Development Code, Section 2.3, which is the supplementary regulations, and it's to add procedures for establishing a residential overlay district. And this is in order to recognize particular needs of an existing neighborhood where an active HOA is not present. It's recommended that procedures be established for an application to be considered. And an overlay district can help preserve, of course, special characteristics of a neighborhood with a specific zoning regulations and design guidelines. You'll think about, last year we went through the creation of the overlay district for Meadowbrook Hills, Milton Estates, and Stonegate Manor. So the recommendation that we're putting forward to you was basically because of that process. The process started with just a few residents that had some concerns about the redevelopment in the neighborhood, and so they came forward. And we had many different public meetings with the residents, and then, some of the residents homeowners would show up at some of the meetings. We would have additional meetings, and they weren't present. These are meetings with staff when we were trying to come up with the overlay district. So we looked at other best practices in other cities for residential overlays, and what they require is that you have a consensus of 30% of the property owners that come together and decide as homeowners what it is that you want to come ask the city within this overlay. So in order to start that process, whereby staff would look at what you're requesting, you have to have 30% of the ownership. We would still reach out to all the property owners within that neighborhood, have meetings with community development before we move forward with presentations to the Planning Commission and the City Council. What we believe this does is establish just a method to where it's not just a few people within the neighborhood. If an overlay and requirements are being established for your neighborhood, we think this is a way to make sure that it is a majority. So the recommendations are to start the procedure with an initial 30% of the threshold of real property owners in support of the overlay, and then you would have to have a 75% threshold of real property owners in support by the time it's presented to the Planning Commission and then the City Council prior to the adoption. And the additions are shown on
Can I
this.
ask a question before you?
Sure.
How did we come up with the 30%?
The 30% is something that we've found in other similar
Other codes.
codes in other cities, and we looked at cities that not all cities are dealing with redevelopment within neighborhoods. So we looked at Decatur, cities that typically would have a lot of different overlays because they have historic districts or they may have redevelopment within a neighborhood. So that's where the 30% came from. The 75% came from another part of the code that we have, the city code, that's used by Public Works, which is for requests for speed humps. You would have to have a majority, 75% of the property owners in support in order to put speed humps. So a lot of times when we're doing our research, we try to use something similar that we already have in the code. I will say that the overlays that we saw in other cities didn't have that 75% requirement. It just had a 30% requirement to get the process started. But to us, we thought that's a milestone that should be reached before you get to a planning commission.
Okay.
And I can go just quickly. I'm not going to read all of these, but and I'm sure you've reviewed it. But of course, it just establishes that we would create a petition that would be used. It has this, the signatures must be people that live on the property, so you have to actually reside on the property. Talks about the 30% that's required must be achieved, and then we initiate a notice to all property owners within the proposed district of a public hearing to be held at the Planning Commission and City Council meetings. Now, the way it's written, it looks like it goes straight to the Planning Commission and City Council once we get the 30%, but obviously we would have some meetings with the property owners, with just staff prior to putting that report together. And then the application and the forms must be accompanied by a boundary map and a complete list of each property located in the overlay district by street address or tax parcel, the requirements for that. And then what are we going to look at? Number one, whether the built environment of a neighborhood and its location, size, or age is one in which it is desirable to ensure that new and remodeled single-family dwellings and related accessory uses and structures are compatible with the height, size, and level of forestation of the existing dwellings and lots. And two, whether there is a need to establish and maintain a balance between preserving the character of a mature neighborhood while accommodating compatible new residential development. So those are the criteria, of course, that we would look at. The 75% requirement. Of course, the staff would conduct the site inspections, write the report and the recommendation, and then the Planning Commission and City Council would also consider any other applicable standards and criteria. I think, yes, and that's the end. So if you have any questions on the criteria, I'll be glad to try to answer those.
Kathy, quick question.
Sure.
What defines a neighborhood? Because, especially in older areas, you could have a collection of houses that are not necessarily a declared neighborhood.
We have final plats for neighborhoods, so there's different neighborhoods within Windward, and there's a final plat for those neighborhoods. We do have individual lots that would not be considered part of a neighborhood because they're not within that final plat.
So I think that's a great question, because I was thinking the same thing. Who defines the neighborhood? So Devore, you could kind of go over Devore. Well, everyone on Devore, that's a different street, so I'm not in this neighborhood. And I know those are probably like working the edges, but I was kind of thinking the same thing. When you start going to those boundaries and we start getting that 30%, that's the issue we're going to have.
We have final plats for all neighborhoods, so it would be the ownership within that recorded final. It's a legal recorded plat that shows the lots within that neighborhood.
So Kathy, I'm sort of in a unique position because I'm not in an HOA. So this would apply to, for example, my neighborhood. I'm glad you would, I would hope you wouldn't put the threshold at less than 75%, because often these types of issues are driven by just a couple of folks.
Right, and that's why we want to establish. Yeah.
Because I have I had a neighbor who I think became very well known to you all, begging for speed bumps in my dead-end 25-house neighborhood, and finally wore everybody down. So I got a speed bump in front of my property now, which kind of stinks because the guy now doesn't live there. So
Did it have the 75%?
Yes, they did, but they didn't come to my house.
Okay.
So, but I mean, the thing is that for folks that are not in neighborhoods that have a homeowners association, often that was something they sought. I have a quirky little street, I think you could say, and we're all full of quirky little people on my quirky little street, including myself in there. But I don't think anybody on my street wants to be in a homeowners association, and
Right.
my concern would be some of the overlay districts would be people trying to sort of get the city to do what a homeowners association would do. And that has me concerned for the folks who would not want that.
Yeah, and that's why the 75% is important, and it goes through a process, a public hearing, where it goes through the Planning Commission as well as the City Council, and you're looking at that criteria to make sure that it is something that should be approved, an overlay. And the example, of course, I have is we just went through the Meadowbrook Hills, Milton Estates, and Stonegate Manor. These are neighborhoods platted on a final plat it's actually 3 different neighborhoods. So you have the 3 different neighborhoods here, and when we started that process, again, we just had a few people starting the process, but what's important is they work together as property owners before they start that process, so they can work together to see what they want. And some of those meetings were pretty heated in the beginning because they hadn't had those meetings as a neighborhood. So when they came into the meetings to get started on what they wanted in the overlay, very different ideas about what that should look like. This puts a criteria together where they're working at least with 30% of the property owners in the beginning to see what's needed. Now, since the adoption of this overlay, which ended up being on this overlay, there isn't architectural styles that are required or restricted to this neighborhood. After a few meetings, they had decided, number one, we don't want to restrict the size of the home, nor do we want to go with just a couple of architectural styles. They wanted to leave that open. But in the beginning, they thought, we want to restrict the size of the homes. Since these were adopted, I have heard from a couple of property owners that they would like to revisit on one of these neighborhoods. And so, our conversations with them is, have you spoken to other neighbors? I think it's important that the city put together and establish a criteria where you are working with some of the neighbors. You're not going to get 100%, but before you start going through that process to make sure others are on board. And we had started putting these overlay criteria for establishing a criteria right after we went through this process, because we thought it needs to be a better process. It needs to be a much better process.
So the thing that does concern me is some of those things like you mentioned, things like homeowners associations would have like architectural styles and that sort of thing. And that's sort of something that you purchase, you buy into that.
Right.
And and then there's people living in these places, they didn't buy that. They expected their city to protect their full Georgia property rights.
Right, and that's why
That concerns me.
we don't want to, as a city, go and put restrictions. It should be, this establishes that those neighborhoods come to us. They're seeking these overlays, and that's what happened here. With the overlays that were created, the city did not seek to create those. It was created at the request of those property owners. So you may have somebody that's in Jane Ellen Way, for example. Those homes are mostly getting redeveloped into very contemporary style, really, really cute. And they're just mostly adding on to the homes. It's not usually a tear down with a large home. If Jane Ellen wanted to come together as a neighborhood and come to us and ask us to look at putting an overlay, that's something that they would work on and bring to us. This is not for us to be proactive to come to those neighborhoods.
I guess my concern would be the 25% that don't want it.
And that's
I
why
think they still deserve city protection of their full property rights. So that is the concern with something like this, that's not done for a specific, I mean, downtown has changed drastically. You can see why there's a difference in downtown. But if you're just in a neighborhood and you're part of the 25%, then our city enabling, the neighbors and the city to put restrictions on folks that don't want that seems I don't know if it stays legally. It seems maybe just wrong.
Well, that's for any public hearing. You have people that may be in favor and may be against. That's why you have the public hearing. In order to hear from those, maybe it is the other 25% that brings something forward and it doesn't get a recommendation from Planning Commission to be approved. Public hearings allow people that are in favor as well as against to come forward, and those are weighed.
Let me play that back, make sure I understand. So the achievement of the 75% does not automatically grant that overlay.
No.
It's still in the public hearing process. The commission, I could side with the 25% in opposition, and the council could do the same thing.
100%. And that's why it's listed as coming, forward with a public hearing. If it was just you get your 75% and then we just do it in, staff, yeah, it's a public hearing process. Just like any zoning decision, it's a zoning decision.
I have a few questions. So the discussion, the staff report identifies this potential overlay is an available tool for neighborhoods that do not have HOAs?
Correct.
So why do we say active HOA? I mean, either you have an HOA or you don't have an HOA.
In the staff report,
Yeah,
we can change that. I mean,
Because-
it's just part of the staff.
okay. And so when this
Yeah, you're right. It should just say HOA.
HOA, because I think you could debate whether it's active or not.
And we don't want to get into the
No,
business.
I know. I wouldn't
Yeah.
think you would.
No.
And so when this gets moving forward, will there be language in the supplementary regulations that talk about this is applicable to non-HOA neighborhoods? Because the way that it's written here, it doesn't say anything. Your staff report gives us that background, but that's
Right.
not in here.
Absolutely. And
Okay.
we'll add that to the first sentence.
Yeah.
because, Yeah, that needs to be clarified, that if there's an HOA, this doesn't apply.
This doesn't apply, because I can
Yes.
anticipate, yes, that becoming maybe a
And this
thing.
just establishes the process.
Yes.
Correct.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
right. Kathy, my other question is more of a, maybe a language thing. You're specific about the fact that it has to be property owners that reside in the neighborhood, right? So
Right.
if you own property and you're renting it, you don't get to vote.
Correct.
You cannot have a say.
Right, you could still come to the public hearing and have your voice, but you can't be part of that.
The 30%.
30 or the 75.
Right. And in the, I guess it's section F where they talk about the 75%, should we also include that you have to reside there? In whatever section where you talk about the 75% is needed.
Yes, here, D.
Yeah,
Yeah, we
in
can
D.
clarify that, because
Add-
I think that's an important part of it.
I think so too, yeah. So we're requiring that for the 30% and the 75%.
Right.
And then my other question is just, the criteria is not an either or. For C1 and 2, it's not either or, it's both.
That's correct.
Correct, okay. That's what I thought, just wanted to clarify that. Thanks.
Yeah, those are good clarifications that
And
we'll
just,
make.
you mentioned something about meeting with the property owners. Is that something you want to codify in?
No, because it could be one meeting, it could be 3, but we'll have to have several meetings to make sure that we're clear before we write our recommendation. And, you know, the other overlay that was started, that we went through the process, a lot of that was because of existing drainage problems. So we wanted to make sure that the overlay that was put in place there, it's very specific, because it's specific on issues that won't exist if you have, 1 acre lots or 2, 3 acre lots. Theirs was very specific. So it can take a couple of meetings. It may be that sometimes we have to pull Public Works into it if it's, those type of issues. So I wouldn't put that in there, because it could be several meetings before.
And one last question, I just thought of it. So moving forward, actually, we could use the one that was just done for the Meadowbrook. How does that overlay regulation, how is that tied to the actual property? So when the property changes hands, is there any kind of a trigger that the prospective buyer understands that there's an overlay that is applicable to this unique neighborhood?
It's within our Unified Development Code. So if you purchase a property,
I
Yes,
never look at the UDC when I'm purchasing property.
yeah, and I don't know if they disclose that when they sell the property, but, a lot of times there's also a final plat that's attached to a property.
And would that be
And you
noted?
that we keep on file. A lot of times people come in and ask those questions before they purchase. We'll get people that ask questions about code enforcement actions in a neighborhood before they purchase. So sometimes it is the due diligence, but, there's a lot of locations in other cities that have historic districts where you can't add on to houses.
Right.
So there, there's different height regulations. So it would be part of their due diligence if they went to the city.
And so would it be noted on a final plat that an overlay, that particular property is part of an overlay?
Well, most of these final plats were already recorded legally many
So there's
years
no
ago.
updates to those?
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
so then it's on the onus
So
of
the way, when they come in for a construction permit, we have to make sure that they're following those different requirements. Most of them have to do with increased requirements for stormwater control within
Right.
the one that we created.
Right.
And they didn't change any of the architecture, but we did have a requirement that's the same in the downtown, where you set your garage 20 feet back from the front of the home, so you don't have a home that has the front facade and then the garage just continues. So instead of doing architectural requirements, they did have that. So they would find that out if they did apply for a building permit. But also throughout the downtown, when we approved the downtown master plan in 2014, properties that are not located in a neighborhood on a final plat, which means mostly along Canton Street, Milton Avenue, not within a neighborhood, they have regulations within the downtown master plan that require historic architecture, same setback for, the 20-foot garage, and those aren't really attached
To anything?
to anything.
Okay.
Yeah, so it does become due diligence, but I've also heard from some of the real estate agents that were in the room when we were putting this together, that they actually think that it helps, with some of the properties that are up for sale, when there's not an established HOA, to at least know that there's some requirements within that neighborhood. They thought that it helped with.
It's a selling point?
Yes.
Yeah.
Kathy, following Karen's question, if someone were interested in buying an existing home lot in one of these neighborhoods, it has an overlay, and they have not done that extra step that most people, I imagine, don't do, which is go look at the UDC, and their intent is to redevelop that lot, they will have made a purchase without knowing that their ability to redevelop that lot will be constrained. Is that a fair statement?
The same as all of downtown.
So Kathy, I'd like to just make a couple of comments. One is, first of all, applaud you and staff for coming up, obviously identifying a need and void. It's almost like Pandora's box you're about to get into on a little bit of HOAs and these kind of structural pieces. So I understand the process you put in place, but also keep it ambiguous. Just kind of have some flexibility within this, because you are going to be dealing with people that don't have an HOA by their own reasoning, right? I mean, there's a lot of people that don't want an HOA. They don't
Right.
want structure. They don't want these kind of elements around them, or parameters or guidelines, however you want to say. So in these, I'll just be careful just in the flexibility that you grant this. It sounds like it's one at a time. You get a chance to do that. But once you create design standards, also kind of have a renewal in there, just because, maybe every 7 years or something, you go back out and your fashions change, right? Everyone right now wants modern farmhouse. Everyone
Sure.
wants to paint their house white. Well, there used to be stucco. I mean, we're having all the elements and these discussions are going on in other HOAs. Oh, well, and even in our HOA, it's like, oh, people want to change, like from stucco to something else. Well, you're not allowed to. It's not in design elements. Well, that's old. That's 90s, because it's an old 90s neighborhood. Have some of that flexibility built in, that, if you do just create a design standard, that, it can be renewed with changing generational and those kind of pieces, but also understand the ambiguous nature of, let's see this one
And that's a
at
good
time.
point. We'll try to, we're not going to any neighborhood trying to get them to come up with regulations. It just establishes it if they do, but that's a good point for us to tell them. You don't want to get so strict on your neighborhood that you're not looking to see what the future may be.
Yeah, because I think the more conditions you put in here, the more you're going to put pulled into that structure.
Right.
Now all of a sudden you're acting like an HOA for their community.
And if you think about, and which a lot of those meetings we didn't have at the Planning Commission, but when we started this one with Stonegate, they started out, the neighborhood wanted a lot of restrictions. But when you had everybody in the room, and I think we had 80 people, and we went through those restrictions, and, staff talked about, these aren't just applying to your neighbor, it's going to apply to your property too. What we ended up with was something much smaller, but really great for that neighborhood. It's going to put in some protections for them that's really important, especially when you're looking at stormwater control, higher protections than other areas within the city. So I think it turned out to be something that they're really happy with.
All right.
If there's no further discussion, I'll make a motion. Do we have to make a motion? The motion to pass PH-23-02 Unified Development Code UDC text amendments for procedures to establish residential infill overlay district.
Any further discussion? All in favor, please raise your right hand. Motion carries. All right, anything else the board would like to discuss?
I don't think we asked for public comment.
Well, we can go back and ask. We just had a workshop. I'm sorry, I jumped the gun. I apologize.
And the chairman is not doing his job either. All right. Motion is to recommend approval by the city council. Anything else? All right, we'll see you in March.